Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for, well, a massive tour of modern America.
It's a huge one.
We're starting in 1980 and running right up to the present day.
Hmm.
I mean, this era is just defined by colossal, fundamental transformation.
That's exactly right. Our listeners shared a really deep historical overview, and our mission here is to synthesize the causes and effects of, five interconnected major shifts?
Five, yeah.
These things completely redefined the U.S. landscape.
Yeah.
We're talking about the rise of modern conservatism, the end of the Cold War, the digital economy just exploding onto the scene.
And also mass migration and then the totally new security challenges of the 21st century.
It's a lot to cover.
It is. And this isn't just about, reciting a list of facts. It's about extracting those key causal links, the surprising data points that explain why America looks the way it does now.
Exactly. We want to get past the headlines and really understand the underlying mechanisms. For instance, what specific policy levers allowed the new right to consolidate power so dramatically? And maybe the most critical question, how did a technology revolution that promised widespread access and opportunity actually managed to widen the wealth gap? The sources are very clear on that.
That is the core question. Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start in 1980 with the political atmosphere that ushered in the whole conservative revolution.
The context for that 1980 election is absolutely crucial. The nation was grappling with something called stagflation.
Which is just a horrible combination.
It's the worst. It's that painful mix of high inflation and economic stagnation. So prices are rising, but jobs are scarce.
And that wasn't all, right?
Oh, no. On top of that, you have the lingering energy crisis from Middle Eastern oil cuts and the ongoing humiliation of the Iran hostage crisis.
So it created this profound sense of national malaise.
A total rejection of the prevailing liberal consensus. And that dissatisfaction, it translated directly into a political landslide.
Ronald Reagan, an exceptional communicator, presenting this really charismatic, optimistic alternative to all that gloom.
And he just swept the election. It was 489 electoral votes to Jimmy Carter's 49.
Wow.
It was a definitive, structural public mandate to change the direction of the country.
And this political structure, it had been building for years, right? This wasn't overnight.
Not at all. By 1980, the new right had coalesced around a very clear three-pronged platform that spoke to different parts of the electorate.
So what were those three pillars?
Okay, so first you have Cold War conservatism, an aggressive anti-communist stance globally.
Okay.
Second, pro-business economics, basically a commitment to deregulation and massive tax cuts. The idea was to spur private sector growth.
And the third?
The third was moral and religious values. This was a reaction against the social changes of the 60s and 70s, specifically targeting things like Roe v. Wade and the feminist movement.
Let's focus on that economic piece for a second. Reaganomics, it was built on this philosophy of supply-side economics.
Right, known popularly as trickle-down.
Trickle-down. So the premise was if you cut taxes, particularly for corporations and the wealthy, they'd reinvest that money.
And that investment would lead to more production, more jobs, and then ultimately prosperity that would, trickle down to everyone else.
The sources cite two huge pieces of legislation there.
They do. The Economic Recovery Act of 1981, which cut income taxes by 25% over 3 years, and then the Tax Reform Bill of 1986, that one simplified the code and lowered the top tax rate quite a bit.
But the sources make it really clear this wasn't just simple budget cutting. The spending side of the equation tells a very different story.
A completely different story.
Social programs were cut. Things like welfare, food stamps, they saw reductions of about $40 billion. But military spending,
it went through the roof,
Yeah.
An astronomical increase. Over $150 billion across Reagan's 2 terms.
so you're cutting domestic programs while dramatically boosting military spending.
And that disparity is the pivotal policy decision of the era. It resulted in annual budget deficits just soaring to between $200 and $300 billion.
So wait, the biggest long-term takeaway from Reaganomics isn't just the tax cut itself. It's that those deficits created a kind of structural roadblock.
Exactly. A structural roadblock ensuring that the government couldn't fund major new social programs for decades, no matter who was in power. The debt itself became a political restraint.
Wow. Okay, and we can't overlook that social conservative force you mentioned.
No, absolutely not. This movement, led by groups like Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority and James Dobson's Focus on the Family, it mobilized millions of conservative Christians who felt alienated by secular culture.
And they use mass media, right?
Massively. Especially television networks like Pat Robertson's CBN to push for the restoration of traditional values.
And this momentum had lasting consequences in one really specific area, the judiciary.
The courts, yes. Reagan appointed 4 Supreme Court justices: Sandra Day O'Connor, Antonin Scalia, Anthony Kennedy.
These appointments cemented a conservative majority.
And that fundamentally shifted the gravitational center of American law. You see the direct results in decisions that started scaling back federal oversight on affirmative action and, maybe most consequentially, expanding state-level authority to regulate abortion.
So political battles were really just waiting to become judicial battles.
Precisely.
Okay, let's shift gears from domestic politics to the biggest global confrontation of the 20th century, the Cold War. Reagan's approach was aggressive.
Oh, absolutely. Ideological and aggressive. Rhetorically, he was fierce. He famously labeled the Soviet Union the evil empire.
Framing it as a moral struggle.
A moral struggle between good and evil. And of course, there was that dramatic challenge, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. This wasn't just theater, it was political and economic warfare.
And the centerpiece of that economic warfare was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI.
SDI, announced in '83.
Otherwise known as Star Wars.
That's the one. It was a proposal for a space-based missile defense system. Now, the technology was totally unproven, but its implication was devastating to the Soviet system.
How so?
The Soviet economy was already incredibly weak. It was structured to prioritize military spending over consumer goods, the mere threat of a new high-tech arms race in space. It forced the Kremlin to think about pouring billions into a system they knew they couldn't technologically keep up with.
So the pressure of SDI forced them to divert resources away from an already crippled consumer sector.
Right, which just exacerbated internal economic unrest. It was a strategy of spending them into collapse.
So it was that combination of military and economic pressure.
Coupled with some genuine diplomatic efforts. You had the Geneva Summit in '85, the INF Treaty in '87. All of it created the conditions for the ultimate Soviet collapse.
And the fall of the Soviet Union just sets the stage for a totally new global order.
Defined by unipolar U.S. dominance. And this dominance manifested in new ways.
Like limited military actions.
Exactly. Like Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989. Economically, the U.S. pushed for global integration, promoting Pacific Rim trade through APEC. And diplomatically, the U.S. took on the role of global arbiter.
The Oslo Accords being a prime example.
Yes. Mediating between Israel and the PLO in 1993. That entire legacy, how, when, and where to use America's singular global power, that became the central foreign policy debate, completely replacing the old Cold War conflict.
Let's transition now to a revolution that, it changed everything. How we live, work, communicate, the digital economy.
The change was so swift and so comprehensive, we went from these massive room-sized computers to the widespread adoption of the personal computer in the early '80s.
And then the internet in the 90s.
The explosion of the commercial internet, yeah. It fundamentally transformed global business and led directly to the huge speculation of the dot-com bubble.
And this technology just completely restructured the American workforce.
Completely. We saw the rapid decline of manufacturing. Deindustrialization hit the Rust Belt so hard.
Yeah.
Cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland lost thousands of high-wage jobs.
And that was due to outsourcing and increasingly automation.
Right. And as manufacturing declined, the service sector just soared to fill that vacuum. By the early 21st century, something like 71% of U.S. jobs were in services.
And the sources use Walmart as a symbol of this shift.
A potent symbol, yeah. A company that created millions of jobs, but they were often low-wage, part-time, and non-unionized.
And that loss of collective bargaining power is a huge driver here. Union membership just plummeted.
It peaked at 35% in 1954 and dropped to around 12% during this period. And without that collective leverage, wages just stagnated.
So this is where we really connect the dots between policy, technology, and inequality.
Yes, because despite these massive productivity gains from technology, workers are creating more value, the real wages for the working and middle class barely budged.
Can you give us that economic inequality data again? Because the scale of the divergence is just shocking.
It is alarming. The wealth concentration between 1979 and 2007. The sources report the top 1% of earners saw their wealth increase by a staggering 275%.
275%.
Now compare that to the middle 60% of earners. They saw a gain of only 40%.
40. During the same 3 decades. That difference is structural. That is a 7-fold difference in wealth accumulation. If productivity was rising, where did all the money go?
The sources point to a convergence of factors. The labor market shift from high-wage manufacturing to low-wage service jobs.
Globalization and outsourcing.
Exactly, suppressing domestic wages. And the restructuring of tax policy that disproportionately favored top earners. Plus, you had the rapid growth of the digital divide.
That term is used a lot. What did it practically mean on the ground?
It wasn't just about owning a computer. It was about unequal access to high-speed infrastructure and digital literacy. People in rural areas or in underfunded schools were locked out of the new high-skill, high-wage jobs that the tech boom created.
So technology, which was supposed to be an equalizer, became another layer reinforcing that economic disparity.
Precisely.
Let's move to demographic changes, which were just as transformative. First, this huge internal population shift within the U.S.
The move toward the Sun Belt, yeah.
Yeah.
This mass internal migration to the South and Southwest was a defining trend. The causes were a cocktail of economic incentives, lower taxes, business-friendly policies, and a technological one.
Air conditioning.
Affordable central air conditioning. It made the warmer climate desirable year-round.
And the political consequences were immediate.
Oh yeah. This population shift increased the political representation of traditionally conservative Sun Belt states in the House and just generally strengthened the Republican Party's influence. And economically, it powered new hubs, including Silicon Valley.
And at the same time, the U.S. experienced this massive wave of international immigration.
A huge wave, fundamentally altering the nation's social fabric. This was driven primarily by the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. The influx, mostly from Latin America and Asia, was so large that immigrants now account for about 1/3 of U.S. population growth.
And this completely reshaped American culture.
Absolutely. You saw the rise of Spanish-language TV networks like Univision, bilingual programs, authors like Amy Tan, whose book The Joy Luck Club brought Asian American perspectives right into the mainstream.
And schools had to adapt.
Dramatically. Expanding English as a second language, or ESL, programs became a necessity.
And it's so important to acknowledge the economic function of this labor.
Yeah.
The sources stress a net positive effect on the American economy.
They do. Immigrants often filled crucial low-wage roles in sectors like agriculture and service work, performing labor that native-born Americans often avoided.
But this cultural integration wasn't without its complexities.
Not at all. It included the rise of the model minority stereotype, mainly applied to Asian immigrants, which sometimes served to politically contrast them with other minority groups. It just highlights the deeply nuanced nature of these shifts.
And that brings us finally to the defining challenges of the 21st century, which were kicked off by the devastating catalyst of September 11, 2001.
The attacks, with the loss of nearly 3,000 lives, created this national demand for justice and security that immediately reshaped U.S. foreign policy. It shifted towards preemptive and preventive warfare.
So when the Taliban refused to hand over Osama bin Laden, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan.
Right, quickly overthrowing the regime, but starting a very long counterinsurgency campaign.
And the invasion of Iraq followed shortly after in 2003. Now, it's critical for the listener to note the source material highlights the difference in justification here.
A huge difference. While Afghanistan was a direct response to 9/11, the initial justifications for the Iraq War alleged links to 9/11 and the existence of weapons of mass destruction were later widely disproven.
And that difference in rationale just fueled massive debates, globally and at home, about executive power and the use of intelligence.
And at home, the war on terror prompted the largest government reorganization in half a century.
The creation of the Department of Homeland Security.
The DHS, yeah. The largest consolidation of government agencies since the Department of Defense was created. But the legislative response was maybe even more intrusive.
The Patriot Acts.
The Patriot Acts of 2001 and 2003. They dramatically expanded the government's surveillance powers, allowing for increased monitoring of citizens' phone records, email.
And critics immediately argued these measures violated constitutional rights.
Immediately, by blurring the lines between domestic law enforcement and foreign intelligence gathering.
And these foreign conflicts focused so heavily on the Middle East, they renewed these fierce simultaneous debates about energy and the environment back home.
Right. Geopolitical risks, military interventions, they all highlighted U.S. dependence on volatile Middle Eastern oil supplies. And at the same time, you had figures like Al Gore raising massive public awareness about global warming.
Connecting U.S. economic consumption directly to environmental impact.
And that debate remains deeply polarized today, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The sources show a clear split. Democrats generally supporting regulation and international agreements, like the Paris Climate Accord.
While Republican stances often reject those measures, sometimes questioning the severity of climate change, or the human contribution to it.
But despite all of these massive internal divisions, culture wars, extreme economic inequality, constant foreign engagement, the sources confirmed that the U.S. continued as the world's leading superpower into the 21st century.
Okay, so let's just briefly summarize what you, the listener, just processed. We started with the mechanics of that three-pronged new right platform, moral, economic, and Cold War, and saw how deficits limited future government action.
We moved through the strategic pressures like SDI that helped end the Soviet Union.
Then we saw those stark inequality metrics of the digital age, where the top 1% saw a 275% wealth gain, while the middle 60% only gained 40%.
And finally, we arrived at the dramatic government restructuring prompted by the post-9/11 security state and that ongoing climate debate.
So the core takeaway here is that the political and cultural debates that define America today, the arguments over immigration, gender roles, the scope of government spending, free trade, all of it,
These are direct, identifiable continuations of the ideological clashes that truly took root and began to define policies starting back in 1980.
which leads directly to our final provocative thought for you to consider. The source material notes the U.S. remained the world's leading superpower, despite the dramatic widening of economic inequality and the persistence of these intense culture wars. Given the rise of globalization and the decline of traditional manufacturing we discussed, what does the source material suggest is the most durable, non-military pillar of continued U.S. global dominance into the 21st century?
Think about the economic hubs and global reach we explored during the digital revolution.